What if I told you that a single book has shaped empires, inspired revolutions, guided laws, and still sits quietly on millions of bedside tables around the world, often unread, but never forgotten? And what if the same book contained stories of burning bushes, walking seas, fallen cities, kings rising from shepherds, prophets arguing with God, and a man who preached love in a world ruled by power? This is not just a book. This is the Bible, and to understand it, even briefly, is to step into one of the longest-running conversations in human history. But here is the surprising truth. The Bible is not a single book at all. It is a library, a collection of texts written across centuries, by different authors, in different languages, under different empires, and in very different states of mind: war, exile, hope, and spiritual awakening. Let us begin where everything begins: Genesis. In the beginning. These words are among the most famous ever written. The Bible opens not with politics, not with war, but with creation itself. The universe is spoken into existence. Light separates from darkness. Oceans are formed. Land appears. Life begins. And then comes humanity. According to the text, humans are created not as servants, but as reflections, in the image of God. This idea alone reshaped how later civilizations would think about human dignity. But almost immediately, the story shifts. Harmony breaks. A garden is lost. And from that moment, the Bible becomes something else entirely. Not just a story of creation, but a story of struggle. Here is my personal observation as a reader of history. Ancient texts rarely begin with innocence, unless they are preparing to explain its loss. The early chapters of Genesis feel like a memory of something perfect that can no longer be held onto. Then comes the flood narrative, a story of destruction and renewal. Entire civilizations are washed away, and only one family survives to begin again. Whether read as theology or mythology, it reflects something deeply human. The fear that progress can collapse at any moment, and that survival is never guaranteed. From here, the Bible turns toward one family in particular: Abraham. He is not a king, not a warrior, not a scholar. He is simply a man who leaves everything behind because he hears a promise. A voice tells him he will become the father of nations, even though he has no children, and he believes it. This is where the Bible begins to introduce one of its central themes: faith as movement into the unknown. From Abraham comes Isaac, from Isaac comes Jacob, and from Jacob come 12 sons who will eventually form the 12 tribes of Israel. But their story does not begin in greatness. It begins in betrayal. One son is sold into slavery by his brothers. He ends up in Egypt, and from there, through a series of political and personal twists, he rises to power. This is Joseph, a man who interprets dreams and survives imprisonment. His story feels almost modern in its psychology: betrayal, ambition, suffering, and eventual reconciliation. And then, Egypt changes everything. What begins as a family story becomes a national one. The descendants of Jacob become enslaved. Generations pass, memory fades, hope weakens, until a man appears in the desert. A man who does not believe he is qualified. A man who stutters when he speaks. A man named Moses. And here, the Bible shifts tone dramatically, from family history to revolution. But that is where we will pause, because the next part is where history, law, and myth begin to collide, and where an entire nation is born in fire, sand, and voice. Moses does not begin as a hero. In fact, if the Bible were written like modern storytelling, he would be an unlikely candidate for leadership at all. He is a fugitive, living in exile after committing a violent act in Egypt. He tends sheep in the desert, far from courts, far from power, far from history. And then, something happens that becomes one of the most iconic scenes in all religious literature. A bush burns, but is not consumed. From it, a voice speaks. Moses is told to return to Egypt and demand freedom for his people. He resists. He argues. He doubts himself. And this hesitation is important. The Bible does not present him as naturally powerful, but as reluctant, almost as if leadership in this narrative is not about confidence, but obedience to a calling larger than oneself. What follows is the Exodus. Egypt, one of the most powerful civilizations of the ancient world, is struck by a series of disasters described as plagues. The river turns to blood, darkness covers the land, and finally, something breaks Pharaoh's resistance. The Hebrews leave. This moment, the crossing of oppression into freedom, becomes one of the defining symbols not only of the Bible, but of human political imagination itself. And yet freedom is not simple. Almost immediately, the people complain. They have escaped slavery, but they have not yet learned how to live freely. Here is an authorial reflection. This part of the narrative feels almost painfully realistic. Liberation is not portrayed as a clean victory, but as a psychological struggle. People often long for freedom, but struggle with uncertainty once it arrives. Then comes the desert, 40 years of wandering, no permanent home, no stable structure, and in that space between slavery and settlement, something foundational happens. Law is given. Moses ascends a mountain and returns with what becomes known as the Ten Commandments. Rules about life, morality, loyalty, and community structure are introduced, not as abstract philosophy, but as survival instructions for a newly formed people. This is where the Bible shifts again. It is no longer just narrative. It becomes law, identity, and national memory. The people eventually enter what is described as the Promised Land. Battles are fought, cities are taken, a society begins to form. But power always changes stories. After Moses comes the age of judges, local leaders who rise and fall depending on crisis. Then comes a demand that changes everything again. The people ask for a king, and so monarchy begins. The first king, Saul, is tragic. The second, David, becomes legendary. David is not only a ruler, but also a poet traditionally associated with the Psalms. Songs of fear, hope, repentance, and devotion. Under his son Solomon, the kingdom reaches its peak. Jerusalem becomes a center of political and spiritual life. A temple is built, an architectural symbol of divine presence. But greatness is fragile. After Solomon, the kingdom splits. Northern and southern regions divide, political instability increases, and slowly the narrative darkens. Prophets appear. These are not kings, nor priests in the traditional sense. They are voices of warning. They speak against corruption, inequality, and moral decay. Figures like Isaiah, Jeremiah, and others challenge both rulers and people, and often they are ignored. Then comes catastrophe, conquests, exile, destruction of the temple. The center of identity is gone. The people are displaced. And yet, this is one of the most remarkable turns in the entire Bible. Faith does not disappear in exile. Instead, it transforms. It becomes portable. It becomes written. It becomes memory preserved in text rather than land. And that is where we will continue next. Because from exile comes something unexpected. A reconstruction not just of a nation, but of meaning itself. Exile changes everything. When a people lose their land, they do not simply lose territory, they lose the physical stage on which their identity has been performed for generations. And yet, in the biblical narrative, exile does not end the story, it forces it to evolve. The Israelites are taken to Babylon. Cities lie in ruins behind them. The temple, once the center of worship and national identity, is destroyed. And here, something subtle but profound happens. Faith detaches from geography. No longer tied to a single place, it begins to live in language, memory, ritual, and interpretation. This is one of the most important transitions in the entire Bible. In my view, it is also one of the most historically significant ideas ever recorded. That identity can survive destruction if it is preserved in text. During this period, prophetic voices become even more intense. They do not simply predict events. They interpret suffering. Prophets like Jeremiah speak of loss as consequence, not random tragedy. Others, like the voice traditionally associated with Isaiah, begin to introduce themes of restoration, hope, and eventual return. And then, history turns again. The Persian Empire rises, Babylon falls, and the exiled communities are allowed to return home. But they do not return to the same world they left. They rebuild the temple, they rebuild walls, they rebuild religious law. Yet something has changed permanently. They are no longer just a kingdom. They are a text-centered people. Now the Bible itself begins to take more recognizable shape as a compiled tradition. Stories, laws, poetry, and prophecy gathered, edited, and preserved across generations. And then, centuries pass in silence. No new major prophetic voices in the same way. No national independence. Foreign empires dominate the region. Persians, Greeks, and eventually Romans. This is often called the intertestamental period, though in reality it is anything but silent. It is a time of tension, expectation, and cultural blending. And it is in this world that the New Testament emerges. Now the tone shifts dramatically. The focus is no longer ancient patriarchs or national lawgivers, but a single figure, Jesus of Nazareth. Born in a small province under Roman rule, his life is described not through political conquest, but through teaching, healing, and symbolic action. He speaks in parables, short layered stories about seeds, lost sons, workers in vineyards, and kingdoms hidden in unexpected places. These stories are simple on the surface, but structurally complex. They function almost like moral mirrors, forcing listeners to interpret themselves. His central message, as preserved in the texts, revolves around love, forgiveness, and the idea that divine presence is not confined to institutions. This was not a neutral message in a heavily controlled political environment. It challenged authority structures, religious and imperial. As a result, conflict becomes inevitable. He is arrested, tried, and executed by crucifixion, a Roman method reserved for political dissenters and public punishment. But the story does not end there. His followers claim that after his death, he appears again, alive. This claim becomes the foundation of what will become Christianity. From this moment onward, the Bible enters its final major phase: interpretation, expansion, and global transmission. Letters are written by early followers, especially Paul, who travels across the Mediterranean world, interpreting the message for different cultures and communities. Small groups of believers form across cities of the Roman Empire. A movement begins that is no longer tied to a single land, temple, or ethnic identity. And that is a turning point unlike anything earlier in the text. The idea that faith is universal, rather than national. Eventually, these writings are collected, debated, and formed into what becomes the New Testament. Together with the Hebrew Scriptures, the Old Testament, they form the Bible as it is known today. But even then, the story does not end. It continues through centuries of interpretation, conflict, art, war, and philosophy. Because the Bible is not only a historical document, it is a living argument about meaning itself. And that is where we will pause before the final conclusion. By the time the biblical canon begins to settle into something recognizable, the world around it is already unrecognizable compared to the world that began in Genesis. Empires have risen and fallen, languages have shifted, cities have been rebuilt over ruins that once seemed permanent. And yet, the Bible continues to move through history, like something larger than any one civilization. At this stage, it is no longer just a collection of ancient texts. It has become a framework through which people interpret reality itself. Manuscripts are copied by hand in monasteries. Texts are translated into new languages. Each translation is not just linguistic, but cultural, because every era reads the Bible differently, and in doing so, reveals more about itself than about the ancient world it describes. Here is an important historical observation. The Bible has never existed in a single, fixed cultural form. It has always been interpreted through the lens of power, education, and worldview. That is part of why it has remained so influential and so contested. As centuries pass, it becomes central to the formation of European law, art, and political thought. It inspires paintings, symphonies, architecture, and philosophical debates about morality, justice, and human nature. But it also becomes a source of conflict, used in wars, reforms, and ideological struggles. Few texts in human history have been both a source of compassion and division at such scale. The printing press marks another turning point. For the first time, the Bible is no longer confined to scribes or institutions. It can be mass-produced. It enters homes. It enters personal reading life. And this changes everything again. Because when people read it directly, without mediation, interpretation multiplies. Different denominations emerge. Different traditions form. The same text generates multiple understandings of authority, salvation, ethics, and community. In the modern world, the Bible continues to exist in this dual state, ancient and contemporary, sacred and historical, personal and political. It is studied academically as literature, archaeology, and historical source material. At the same time, it is read devotionally as spiritual guidance. Few works in human history occupy both spaces so fully, and perhaps the most striking aspect is this: even in an age of science, technology, and global communication, the Bible remains one of the most widely read, translated, and discussed texts in the world. Why? There is no single answer. But part of it may be that it does not behave like a simple narrative. It is not just about what happened. It is about what it means. And meaning is never finished. It expands with each generation that reads it. It changes depending on who is asking the question. It survives not because it is static, but because it is interpretive. If we step back from it as historians, we see something unusual. A text that is simultaneously a mythic origin story, a legal code, a national chronicle, a collection of poetry, a philosophical debate, and a theological claim about the nature of existence. And yet, despite all of that complexity, its core themes remain surprisingly simple: creation, fall, struggle, law, exile, hope, return, redemption, or in more human terms, where we come from, what went wrong, how we live together, and what we hope might still be possible. My personal reflection here is this. The Bible endures not because it answers every question, but because it preserves the questions in a way that feels permanent. It is less like a closed book and more like an ongoing conversation across time. And perhaps that is why it still matters, because long after empires disappear, and long after the languages of those empires are forgotten, humans still ask the same questions. Who are we? Why do we suffer? And what does it mean to live well? The Bible, in its vast and uneven way, is one of humanity's oldest attempts to answer and endlessly re-ask those questions. And that is the end of the story, which is also why it never truly ends.